If you double it again from 400 to 800 parts per million, if we did that in the next few decades, the effect on temperature is vastly smaller than the first doubling. It's logarithmic. So that graph alone, if you saw it, is just, to an engineer, I saw this in my first couple of hours. I said, hold on a minute. Anything we'd get from CO2, which is tiny in temperature effect, it's now, we're not going to get any more, or it's going to be 10 times less. So in other words, there's no engineering problem. That's clear as crystal. Want to see an evisceration of the net zero nonsense? Well, during this video with Eddie Hobbs and Counterpoint, the second half of my interview with him the other day, I released the first part on mass migration a short while ago here. I do put in the word nice weather instead of certain words you're not allowed to say anymore on this platform since around a year ago, or you'll get demonetized and your reach limited. So I hope you'll bear with me when the nice weather phrase comes up, and let's see how it works out. But it's a fantastic chat, great one to share. I'll put a link to this whole video below, compressed form, so you can upload it elsewhere and help your friends and family. Here we go with Eddie Hobbs.
So can we just, we're going to first start with
nice weather.
But let's just have a look at what Trump actually said at the UN. I know you've looked at it, but a lot of our viewers may not have seen it.
It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion.
Nice weather.
No matter what happens, you're involved in that. No more
nice weather.
No more global cooling. All of these predictions made by the United Nations and many others, often for bad reasons, were wrong. They were made by stupid people that have cost their countries fortunes and given those same countries no chance for success. If you don't get away from this
weather
scam, your country is going to fail.
Well, it isn't very interesting. Leave aside how one might personally feel about the leader of the United States of America. You've looked at the whole
nice weather.
No, because we had a discussion some years ago when you decided to start looking at it, and you rang me because you were saying, like whatever about the impenetrable side of COVID and the pandemic, this thing was easily cracked open. So what did you see when you went at it?
Yeah, Dee, well, I was actually quite surprised because COVID, you referred to there, that had a lot of complexity early on. Like any complex problem, I spent a whole career on them. Early on, it's very hard to work out what's going on. It takes a long time, a lot of data. But when the weather thing exploded after Ukraine, after COVID, weather came along 24/7. So I said, I'd better look into this one, because now I was really interested in everything geopolitical because of the experience during COVID. So I looked into it, and I say in a few hours I realized, as a complex problem-solving engineer for 4 decades, it only took a few hours to look. And what you do when you want to understand if a hypothesis is correct or not, you do the opposite of what most people do, oddly enough. You look for conflicting data, not the affirming data. And that's the way I ran my whole career. That's why I was successful. So I looked for any conflicting data, and quickly it mounted up. So I did a graph. I did multiple graphs, but you picked one out. We look back in history and we see that cyclically the temperature has gone up and down on planet Earth for millions of years. And there's nothing notable about where we are now. And it's due to Milankovitch cycles, the movement of the Earth through the solar system. So a lot of science. I looked up all that. But there's nothing that actually supports strongly the nice weather disaster hypothesis. Weather has always been changing. A good example is, as a refuting point, is that the CO2 that Al Gore showed correlates with the temperature. It's quite convincing in a little zoomed in graph. But actually the CO2 around 600 to 800 years after the temperature changes, the CO2 follows the temperature changes. And that's because most of the carbon is in the oceans.
Was that graph where there was a big gap in the middle? Yeah, there was a lot of white space, and then you had a temperature movement up on top, and then you had CO2 below. But when you compressed the two lines together, there was a gap of 800 years. So what you're saying there, if I'm reading it correctly, is that the CO2 was following the increase in temperature as opposed to the other way around.
Exactly. It was behind it. So in other words, in root cause or causal chains, the carbon dioxide concentration, the actual temperature change is the cause of that. And we know the mechanism. It's basic physics. So basically the oceans sequester most of the carbon dioxide. And like anyone knows with a nice beer, if you warm up the beer, the carbon dioxide goes out of it. And if you cool it down, you can put super high carbon dioxide in. It's really fizzy. So the oceans are the same. So it takes hundreds of years, but when the temperature of the Earth moves due to sun activity and Milankovitch cycles and myriad other effects, what happens is the carbon dioxide is let out of the oceans. And because the stores are massive in the ocean, it just lets out some and it changes quite notably in the atmosphere. But the idea that one causes the other backwards is kind of absurd. There's a tiny effect, Arrhenius noted back in the 1800s, a tiny effect, but the idea that it's driving the bus is quite frankly absurd.
Now, I find that interesting because I remember at the start of COVID, you were focusing on the Diamond Princess data, and that's what really got you into it. And here you're looking at, what you just described. So I presume that brought you then to, looking at, how did it all come about? How did we end up with UN IPCC models, and what were your findings when you did that?
Right. Well, that's very important, are the origins of any hypothesis. So the pure science is just looking to see is it correct or not, looking at conflicting data, doing evidence for against tables, is not, Kepner-Trago, all that hardcore stuff. But you also, in these geopolitical things, need to look at where they came from. And the best rendition of that story is Dr. Jakob Nordengard, I know you know quite well. He, as a ponytail professor in a climate university in Sweden, back around 15, 16 years ago, was genuinely concerned about nice weather, genuinely concerned about peak oil, and he did papers and publications and all that stuff. And he was really worried. So he asked the professors, the dons, the experts, where are the origins? And I want to go deeper in the science. And they only knew weather change back to the IPCC in the 90s. And he could not understand how the experts, their knowledge started in the 1990s. It seemed crazy. So he went, like I would or you would, and he dug. And it only took him a couple of days, and the root cause of where nice weather came from went clear as crystal back to Rockefeller Brothers Fund in the 1950s. So he thought, the big oil men, that's who started all this? And they funded the Club of Rome, and they funded myriad organizations. The reason Sweden is such a big...
So the Club of Rome was the early 70s, Ivor, was it? Or was it
1971 or 2, I think. Agnelli funded it. So Agnelli was Italy's richest man, and he was in Chase Manhattan Bank with David Rockefeller, the big Rockefeller, big buddies. Everywhere you look, you get the big oil, big banking, and the likes of Agnelli. And they all work together to fund what they really want is world government. And David Rockefeller said before he died, when he was in his 80s, he said, I've been accused of wanting, a world government essentially under rule. And if so, I stand guilty of that. So he didn't even hide it. But nice weather, they realized, because after nuclear, the advent of nuclear weapons, war could always be used as a major control of, the ants in the ant farm, the masses. But now that was problematic because of nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction. So they looked and brainstormed way back in the 50s and 60s, and they said international terrorism is a global issue. Ecological and nice weather, a global issue requiring a global solution, which we will have to give. And they listed out these various opportunities, crises and opportunities.
But did that include pandemics as well, by the way?
It most certainly did.
All right, okay.
So the two big ones, actually, the really big ones, were nice weather and global health, pandemics being the big thing. Because you don't care about global health, you don't care if half the people in the country are starving. Obviously, these people, they're kind of a bit sociopathic. But they care about global panics and global issues, problem, reaction, solution. So create the panic and then come in with the solution. So weather and pandemics are pretty much, they're just two mechanisms.
So when did it take on then at the UN? Was that in the early 80s that they started to, like the very, very early stages of the discussion around nice weather? Well, it was called nice weather in those days because we'd come out of a cooling period, if I recall correctly. But what actually happened then? Can you just walk us through that? We're now, as far as everybody's concerned, it's almost presented as a given fact. That the science is complete, settled. The science is settled, which of course is a nonsense because the scientific method is never settled.
Of course.
So how did we end up in a situation where Ireland is committed to Agenda 2030, which is to do with all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is all linked into the same agenda, zero carbon, and we're bolted into it now to try and hit certain targets in 5 years' time, which is why I believe Maria Steen was stopped from becoming a nominee, because we didn't want to have an independent barrister in there, getting in the way of the sort of pipeline of legislation that's coming through. But we're now in a situation where the most powerful leader in the world, representing the largest economy with all of its resources, has walked into the very chamber that have created all of these models and said it's a hoax. Is he overstating?
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to watch. And of course, all the legacy media and the usual propagandists came out and just say, oh, it's the orange man, yada, 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 which is getting quite tiresome. But no, he's broadly correct there. I mean, that's the reality. I'm not saying he's correct on everything, but he's certainly correct on that. To the history, which is worth briefly checking in on. So remember, the United Nations, Rockefeller and co. Donated the land in New York and funded it. They had tried the League of Nations, the big banking families in the early 1900s. League of Nations didn't take because the US refused to get involved. It wanted to stay sovereign. So that project failed, but the United Nations then worked out better. And they got everyone to join, including the US. And then once the United Nations was set up, it was going to be a vehicle for world government, ultimately. And it could also roll out the mechanisms of pandemics through the WHO, which is UN, Agenda 21, and all these things. But just to really compress it, in the 1970s, the Club of Rome was set up. And that's kind of a super rich guys, influencers club for terror and propaganda. And they set up the IPCC ultimately. I think it was 89 or 91, but that's where they were ready enough to really put together a worldwide intergovernmental panel. It was the right time. And that's when it really started getting going, because they got scientists and scientists and scientists. There was no end of money. And of course, any scientist that questioned the hypothesis was simply discarded, funding gone. So they quickly learned there's no success here for me. And any scientists that would go along with it and catastrophize got funded hardcore and became much wealthier and more successful. So if you imagine that natural evolution from the 90s to today, like 30 years, over a generation of scientists with that selection pressure powerfully applied, big money go with the hypothesis, no money and ostracized and ridiculed if you don't. You end up with the so-called 97% of scientists agree. And even that, it's hilarious, Eddie, that 97% paper that I believe was funded by Obama, some Australian guy did it, that's actually total fraud. Because if you look at the scientists that actually agree that there is
nice weather,
the temperature is man-made, and it's heading to a catastrophe, the real message of net zero, you're down to 1% or so, or 2%. But they included everyone who said, oh yeah, I've heard about
nice weather.
So that's fraud. But here we are, and you're right, the cooling. In the 60s and 70s, I think there was a slight downtick in the temperature, and we had Leonard Nimoy did a big documentary, and we're going to all die in an ice age.
Dr. Spock, yeah.
Dr. Spock. Yeah. And then that happened for a few years, and then it kind of curled, and then they went with, the warming. And that one, because we naturally have a rising temperature, around 0.6 degrees in the last 50 years, approximately, less than a degree, they ran with that. And that one is sustainable as a narrative because technically the temperature is going up. But the modelling, it's comical when you see the modelling graphs. So when you look at around 50 modelling groups in
weather,
all funded to the hilt. There's loads of money to go around.
And they combine into the UN IPCC report, is it? Those 50?
They do.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so you got a 1,000-page report, but the summary from IPCC reports is very politically biased. But when you actually read the report, you find out the IPCC, in their most recent one, have said there is no evidence supporting any change in tornadoes or forest fires or any other climatic event. There's no change in those patterns. In fact, the 30s in America was a lot hotter and a lot more forest burning. So the IPCC kind of has to stick to the truth largely in the huge report. But then when you get the synopsis for the press...
Oh, the media, that's where it goes bananas, right?
That's where it goes bananas. That's where the scientists step back and let the politicians take over.
Do you know why? I find that quite interesting because I've asked a lot of people, have you ever read a UN IPCC report, especially the zealots? And They haven't. But when you do, you see a lot of ifs and buts and high certainty, mid certainty, low certainty. So this model is based on a huge amount of moving parts. So I interviewed Dr. Judith Curry, you may have heard of her,
Yes.
last year, and her book is an absolute revelation, and it's really worth studying. But what really jumped out at me, and I wanted to ask you about this, because I'm a bit history buff, and a year before the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, actually, destroyed the sweet spot in Islam, in 1258. In 1257, there was a very substantial volcano went off in Southeast Asia called Samalas. I'm just looking up my notes here, in a place called Lombok Island. And it was regarded as the largest volcanic explosion in about 10,000 years, or at least up there at the top. And it put a huge amount of stuff into the atmosphere, something like 40 cubic kilometers of dense rock went up into the atmosphere. And no, they're saying it's contributed, but they're not saying it's entirely contributed. But the temperature then falls, especially in the northern hemisphere, for the next 500 years until around 1850, and then it starts to warm again. So we had a mini ice age caused not by CO2, but by a volcano, or certainly it would have contributed towards it. I mean, I found that in our book, and the most important thing I found was this idea that, I just have this here, I often use it, just a little coin, and I'll say, look, that is, no, I didn't know any of this until I read her book and did the study and talked to people like you, but that coin is, say, the Earth. And standing behind it is an orb something like 109 times bigger than the Earth. And we're being told by the UN IPCC models that glowing orb, which pulses and has cycles, is having a negligible, if no impact at all, on the atmosphere. Instead, what's causing it is us breathing, but CO2 itself, what percentage of the atmosphere is human-derived CO2? Do you know?
Well, the percentage at the moment is 400 parts per million, I think 0.04%.
Yeah.
So it's obviously tiny. And if you see the diagram for the amount of CO2 in a big block, it clearly is, it's just astonishingly small. The thing about CO2, we've gone from around 250 parts per million, I think, to around 420 now, 0.042. So it's still at a tiny level. And in the past, CO2 has been up at 2,000 parts per million, like 5 times more. And it doesn't correlate with temperatures over the millions of years, so there's that. But it's a tiny amount. The problem is really that Arrhenius, the great physicist who I studied greatly in college, Arrhenius did hypothesize that the CO2 could have a greenhouse effect, a small effect, and it might help us not go into another ice age as quickly. So he saw it as maybe a good thing, but it's a tiny little help, Mammy's little helper. But the reality is that CO2, when you double it or nearly double it, it has a certain effect, which is tiny. If you double it again from 400 to 800 parts per million, if we did that in the next few decades, the effect on temperature is vastly smaller than the first doubling. It's logarithmic. So that graph alone, if you saw it, is just, to an engineer, I saw this in my first couple of hours, I said, hold on a minute, anything we'd get from CO2, which is tiny in temperature effect, it's now, we're not going to get any more, or it's going to be 10 times less. So in other words, there's no engineering problem. That's clear as crystal. But of course, that's just one other conflicting fact that will not be discussed. And this is the thing. The consensus, the science is settled. And Steve Koonin did a book. He was provost of Caltech. He was Obama's science head of administration. He's pretty much saying all this too. And it's hard to cancel him because he's such a huge figure. And he wrote the book Unsettled. But the whole thing has no basis. In my critical thinking class, and I'll finish with this, sorry, Eddie, but I do a 3-hour online critical thinking class, and I go through a lot of the engineering problem-solving root cause stuff, but we use often
nice weather
as an example, and it comes out as a total rout, because in the is not, and in the evidence for against tools, when you actually catalogue all the facts, it's a slam dunk. I mean, it's crazy. And the CO2 one example of is not. I asked the audience online, Well, what is
nice weather?
Apparently, they say, and what is it not? Because we learn a lot from distinctions. And one of the things that comes up, well, it is CO2 and methane and cow farts. And they say, very good. What is it not? Apparently. And it's not melancholy cycles, it's not the sun, which is nearly everything, and it's not anything else. And I said, what we deduce from this, what it is and what it is not, and I write up fraud and political in capitals. Because the IPCC made a decision, a dictate, many years ago, that they will only look at CO2 and methane and anthropomorphic things. And I said, that is fraud, because in any problem-solving process, you always look at the full gamut of factors. And then you rack and stack them from the important ones with the biggest magnitude of effect down to the small ones. And at some point you cut it off and you don't bother. That would be CO2, by the way. And when you do that, you then look at addressable root cause. So in fairness, the biggest factor might not be addressable. So you might push it down, Pareto principle, but you go through the addressable ones. The problem here with
nice weather
is the so-called addressable ones. Their effect is so small that you wrap up the team and you go home.
So, I mean, I suppose the conflict that people have in listening to a discussion like this is that they look out and they see, they see these zero carbon nut jobs, throwing paint on extraordinary works of art, blocking city centres. And then they look at their own political establishment in Ireland, which is almost like a hidden programme for government, which is the adoption of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in 2030. It's driving all our policy, and yet nobody is discussing it. In point of fact, if you look at the media, I don't know if you see this, but it's cut and paste between the New York Times, the Irish Times, and the Guardian.
Yeah.
And so we're in a cycle, or do you think we're in a cycle of similar type of propaganda that drove COVID? I mean, are there parallels there?
There are, only COVID was a kind of a short, sharp shock. And there was great advantage taken from that, obviously. Suddenly there's a pandemic, hasn't been in 100 years. Everyone goes, oh my God, save Granny.
Nice weather.
Just remember, 1950s, it got going in earnest with Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the richest family in America, heavily connected into vastly richer banking families who also have an interest in managing the world, hopefully for our benefit, but I don't think so. So it starts back then, and endless money, resources, ultra-rich individuals, NGOs in latter decades. This train has been coming down the track for 70 years. So people can just imagine how fraudulent the narrative will be after 70 years of funding by the biggest, kind of most influential players on the planet. So that might help people understand how this seems like crazy. 70 years of money and very, very well organized at a high level, kind of strategizing and planning makes for a pretty crazy universe. And that's where we are. And like I said, it's a key point worth reiterating, the 97%, that was achieved by them, and that is fraud. Because you simply put the scientists through an evolutionary process. People are familiar with natural selection, and that natural selection process has all the scientists agreeing, even if deep down they know it's nonsense, because the ones who stand up and say it's nonsense, poof, their career's gone.
And they don't get the funding.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's no way that we can hit zero carbon without creating poverty throughout the Western world, degrowth agenda. Yet we're barreling in that direction. And that's why I wanted to talk to you, because I found the media reaction to Trump in the UN was typically just full of tropes and personal insults and all of that, and not realising that this man represents the most powerful economy in the world. He's making an absolutely dramatic statement. He was saying that we're not buying this green hoax, as he calls it, from now on. So that means that the entire funding, the model that has the biggest, most powerful contributor to all that is pulling out. And it's and basically warning Europe and saying, look, you've got a serious problem here.
That'll do it, folks. Nice weather indeed. What a farce. And I often mention, and I'll do again here, that physical gold and silver, I believe, and all my macroeconomic experts worldwide similarly, are very important. So the bad guys, if you will, the central banks, are piling up on physical gold for the last 5 years, especially since 2019 when the Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, headed the snake, declared gold to come way up the chart and be the only other tier 1 asset, physical gold, alongside the US sovereign debt or the dollar. So that was a huge move, and it got me getting involved in a big way. So the guys at Pure Gold can fill you all in on this and more, and give you great advice on how to possibly hedge yourself and your family and not let the bad guys do all the clever stuff. We need to be watching these things ourselves. So there's a link below. Give them my name. They'll look after you. And there's a period of free storage, I believe, with this link, and also a great free consultation. So, not financial advice, but I suggest to everyone that they get their act together, like myself and many of my colleagues worldwide thankfully have. So till next time.